From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Boris Johnson resigns as head of his Conservative Party, though he will remain as prime minister until a Tory successor is chosen. The rise and fall of Boris Johnson. Boris, as everybody knows, the flamboyant politician, is an astonishing political story, and of course it has lessons for Britain's Tories, but also for other conservative parties and politicians around the world. Welcome. Joe Sternberg is in London, my colleague there, and Kim Strassel, who's not in London, but has worked there in the past. Welcome to you both. Let's listen to Boris Johnson today announcing his resignation from outside number 10 Downing Street.
And in the last few days, I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much, and when we have such a vast mandate, and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects. It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. I know that there will be many people who are relieved, and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
Them's the breaks. Well, you don't hear that every day from a political leader on his way out of office, but somehow it fits Boris Johnson's personality. He was the leader who won a huge Tory victory in 2019 by promising to finally take the country through the Brexit from Europe that the voters had voted for in a referendum, breaking through years of vacillation and division in the Conservative Party on Brexit. He also saved the country in that election from Jeremy Corbyn's radical Labour Party that had taken a dramatic left turn under Corbyn. Both of these are, I would argue, historic achievements, and certainly Brexit. But Joe, here we are, less than 3 years later, he's being forced out. What happened?
Well, so there's sort of the proximate thing that happened, and then there's the actual thing that happened. So, I mean, sort of if you read a lot of the media coverage of this, you'll get the impression that what went wrong is that he got dragged down by a few scandals. There were scandals over parties that he and his staff held in his office during the pandemic lockdowns. There was another scandal involving sexual harassment allegations against a Conservative member of Parliament that Boris might have known about and then overlooked. So that kind of has provided the trigger for his ouster. But the underlying problem was the economy. I mean, the UK is in the middle of a cost of living or inflation crisis right now. Household energy bills for electricity and natural gas are going through the roof. People are paying record amounts to fill up their car with gasoline or diesel whenever they go to the service station. Food is more expensive. The economy never really got on its right feet again after the pandemic, and it became harder and harder for Boris to articulate any kind of plan for solving that. In fact, he often threatened to make it worse, as when they increased the payroll taxes. They were threatening to increase the corporate income tax. They were imposing a windfall profits tax on energy companies. It created this general sense of drift or directionlessness on the economy, and I think that it was probably really voters' frustration with that lack of clear message, lack of clear direction from the Conservative Party, who are supposed to be good at that then made the public more receptive to the notion that these scandals that were coming along were really a sign that time was up for Boris.
Well, Kim, I think everything that Joe says I agree with, but I think where the scandals hurt was less the scandals per se. I think he could have survived the party's scandal. In fact, he did. But the real problem was that he simply lied too often about all of this stuff. I mean, he never told the truth. He said parties weren't really parties. They were working events. And then that turned out not to be true. He's done that time and again. And I think the credibility with his colleagues simply eroded, and with the public across the UK eroded. How do you see it?
Oh, absolutely. It's one thing to say, oh, there were no parties, but then try holding that up when there are pictures pictures in the press of a wine fridge being delivered into Downing Street to keep everybody fueled during pandemic lockdowns. And you saw that again. It's considered, and I'm happy to see this, is considered to be quite bad still in England to mislead Parliament. And he did this not just on the allegations of partying. There was another big scandal about a donation that was used to fund a renovation of Downing Street. There was ultimately fines there, and a lot of stuff came out that seemed to be different than what Boris had said. So you add all these up, but what it really did is, and I do agree with Joe on this, is that dissembling and all of these scandals allowed for those in his party that truly disagreed with him on the direction of Britain's economic course, who had other issues with his leadership, to come together and gave him the opportunity to go after him. And I think one lesson here is, as even Boris alluded to in those comments he made, you can often withstand pressure from a very long time when it's coming from your opposition. But when you have a rebellion inside your party and it reaches a critical mass, which it had done in recent days, there have been more than 50 ministers and senior aides who had resigned in just the last few days. That is impossible to withstand.
Yeah, I think one lesson here is that inflation is a real political killer, maybe the most deadly in politics, because everybody feels it. And Joe suggested Britain is going through a major inflation. And the factors that have played into this, the policies that have played into this, Joe, I want to expand on a little bit because, the Tory party has traditionally been, certainly since Thatcher, the center-right party on economics, campaigning on low tax, sometimes even cutting taxes, campaigning on fiscal conservatism, and in fact, David Cameron and his chancellor being widely accused of austerity when they were in power. What happened on Boris's front? I mean, you have him raising the corporate tax to 26% from 19%, when what he should have been doing is cutting those taxes in the wake of Brexit to make Britain a magnet for investment. He did the opposite. When the windfall profits tax on energy companies at the same time you're trying to encourage energy companies to produce more, to invest more, to produce more fossil fuels. Crazy. You have a 2.5% increase in the payroll tax to finance the National Health Service after he'd promised that the National Health Service would have a Brexit dividend. That's a tax on wages. What are the roots of this? Do you simply not believe in traditional Tory economic policies, or was this related to a political calculation of how to win over the working class voters that Tories did pretty well, very well in 2019?
Well, I think the answer is actually both of those factors, because, really a lot of this has to do with the fact that British politics is still trying to digest that Brexit referendum when voters voted in 2016 to leave the European Union. And you had always had a bunch of different theories about what had prompted that, and there was a wing within Boris Johnson's Conservative Party that hoped that this was a sign that actually the UK was ready for a big round of economic liberalization, that voters had voted to cut taxes, slash bureaucratic red tape on the economy, turn the country into a form of Singapore-on-Thames that would be so much more economically competitive than Europe. But there was an alternative school of thought, even within the Conservative Party, that thought, no, actually, this was more about cultural issues and sort of a woolly sense and British identity, but that a lot of the working class or blue-collar voters who voted for Brexit still want a more paternalistic approach to the economy from their government. And Boris came to represent that second camp. So I think that a lot of the economic agenda that he was really very invested in was this notion that people didn't want the Singapore-on-Thames, that those voters actually wanted more public spending that would be directed at their part of the country. So you would get gimmicks like, leveling up agenda, they called it, which was really a big scheme that was supposed to divert a lot of taxpayer money to economically deprived parts of the north of England, but without really a clear plan for how you were really going to unleash economic prosperity or entrepreneurship there. It was all about the redistribution. And I think the problem is that strategy, just in terms of the economic outcome, has run out of road for the Conservative Party. They discovered that it is not really generating economic growth or security or prosperity the way that a more Thatcherite liberalizing program had back when Margaret Thatcher did it 40 years ago. And that has created this political environment where voters no longer trust Boris Johnson and the Conservatives on the economy. And circling back to these scandals, that then sort of gets the voters to really start thinking in a new way about all of the other things that they don't trust Boris on, including some of these scandal issues.
So the school of thought, Kim, of the Boris Johnson types, and there's a consultant in UK named Nick Timothy who has been a supporter of this strategy that Joe described, the second strategy, that in order to get the British working class and create a new majority party combined with the traditional Tory smaller government voters is to promote bigger government and income redistribution to these other working class voters. And I guess the school of thought suggests, well, when they voted for Brexit, it was for a sense of British nationalism and independence, but really they'd love the European welfare state. Was that the calculation?
That is a calculation. I think it was absolutely a wrong calculation, as we often talk about. I can't think of how many times we've said it in our editorials and on here. Good policy makes for good politics. In this case, it was the Tories chasing it the other way around. They saw all those Brexit voters, really wanted to cater to them. They end up getting a bunch of consultants who tell them to do a bunch of essentially left of center economic policies as a way of trying to keep them on board. And that is everything from what you mentioned about raising payroll taxes to put more money into the National Health Service. It was total income redistribution. And you end up, though, with the economic situation that you do in Britain, in which everyone's unhappy. And this is fundamentally, I would argue, a failure of Boris Johnson to lead. I think he did when it came to uniting what was a very fractious Conservative Party on Brexit. He did it in a somewhat ruthless manner by ditching dozens of lawmakers who opposed what he wanted to do and even suspending Parliament at one point. But he kind of saw his will through there. In this case, there remained, as Joe noted, a significant part of the party that wanted to see these free market policies put in place. They felt that that was what the party had, in fact, campaigned on. But then once Boris actually took control, they instead tried to govern much more from the left. And that is what is left. And there's a lesson here for the U.S. Republican Party, by the way, too, many of whom themselves are arguing that there needs to be more of a focus on catering to the sort of populist impulses of some blue-collar voters here, especially on issues of immigration and trade, and slightly different issues here, but ones that nonetheless, I think this shows some of the perils of doing that.
All right, Kim, we want to talk more about the broader lessons of Boris Johnson's tenure as Prime Minister, but we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we will talk about the implications for foreign policy of Johnson's, particularly Ukraine, of Johnson's exit when we come back.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kim Strassel and Joe Sternberg. One more policy point I want to talk about, Joe, regarding Boris Johnson, and that's his climate agenda. And, of course, the catastrophe that are rising energy prices in Britain. He was a real green aficionado, signed on with the net zero ambitions of the United Nations climate activists, and devotee of subsidies for green energy, renewables, taxes on fossil fuels. And one of the consequences of that, when you combine those policies with the general inflation and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is that households have seen their rates for home electricity and natural gas spike 54% in April. 54%. That's higher than California, Joe. And with another 40% expected in October. That's just deadly for a political coalition. What's the lesson here about green energy policies?
The lesson is don't do it, particularly if you're a conservative government. This is such an interesting story because, in a sense, Boris was really only taking a bunch of the British Conservative Party's neuroses on the climate and countryside and the environment issues in general, but putting them on steroids. I mean, the conservatives have always had an element within the party who live in rural areas, who care a lot about natural beauty and protecting the countryside, and didn't like things like onshore wind farms or natural gas fracking that would mess up the views when they were out on their country walks. But Boris really kicked that up by a factor of 100 with his embrace of net zero. I think partly it was a belief that this was the thing that younger voters would care about, so that the Tories could have some hope of dealing with the age imbalance that has often created difficulties for them in elections. I think that partly it was a sense that maybe this was what the Tory electorate itself was increasingly interested in, because they did have this historical concern for, what you might call countryside issues here. And partly it might just be sincere personal belief on Boris Johnson's part, that he thought that this is all kind of the sort of leadership that was demanded of him to turn Britain into a zero-carbon economy, and that it also would be good for the economy, that otherwise he didn't have a lot of good plans to rev up. But it has just been an enormous disaster, because it is driving up the costs that households have to pay with no discernible benefits, and we haven't even gotten to the energy security problems, things like the stability of the electric grid. In Europe, that tends not to be much of a problem at all during the summer, because there's not a lot of demand for air conditioning in this climate, and you also have a lot of daylight because the days are very long at this time of year. But come the winter, this reliability problem is really going to come into focus, and that's going to expose a whole new level of flaws and weaknesses in a lot of Boris Johnson's environmental policies, which I think people are going to be cleaning up after him for years to come now.
Yeah, a classic example, and I think we're seeing it in other countries, of the folly of this rush to net zero and rush to this energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables, because it sounds good politically and is seemingly popular, although when people see the results of it, turns out not to be popular at all. And that's, I think, a tremendous lesson for American conservatives as well. Kim, let's talk about the foreign policy implications here of Boris's departure, because I think one of the strengths of his tenure has been his foreign policy, particularly the strong stand he's taken in support of Ukraine since the Russian invasion. In Europe, in particular, it's been a very important counterweight to Emmanuel Macron, the French president, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor. He's much more aligned with Poland and the Baltic states and Joe Biden in giving stalwart support to Ukraine. And I wonder how much that's going to hurt Ukraine. And of course, the Kremlin couldn't be happier. They're cheering his departure.
I would argue that he's actually even led Joe Biden on a number of occasions, and for the good. Don't forget that, he was there walking the ground in Ukraine. There have been a lot of stories about the speed with which Britain moved to transfer equipment to Ukraine, things that Ukraine was asking for that they sent and were getting there even before the United States had made a decision on that. And as you said, his decision to ally himself very strongly with Eastern European has put a lot of pressure on Germany and France to, if not join in this with alacrity, at least to not make some of the worst decisions that they might have made. There's been a lot of pressure for them to do the right thing on energy, and a lot of pressure for them to, in fact, send more to the Ukrainians than, for instance, Germany's original plan of just sending some helmets. So this has been really important. I am very concerned to see what comes next. I think the good news is that some of the people that are at least considered front runners as possibilities to replace him are ones that would seem to fall in that mold. There was a Snap poll not long ago, and it was good to see that among those that were at the very top was the current Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, whose profile has really come up. He's a former soldier, but he was the lead guy, has been, for UK support for the Ukraine. So I agree. I think Putin is applauding the downfall here, but I think we can maybe possibly hope, and we should be pushing for somebody that steps up to what has traditionally been Britain's very consequential role in international relations, and often a leadership role.
Another prominent Tory, Liz Truss, the current foreign secretary, has also been very strong on Ukraine, and she is mentioned as well by people as a potential successor to Boris Johnson. I've met her. She's quite impressive and also has a strong free market belief. And in contrast to Ben Wallace, who I think is something of a blank slate when it comes to economics. Joe, any other names that you want to throw out there as potential successors here?
I think one dark horse candidate that sometimes gets mentioned is a member of parliament named Tom Tugendhat, which is also an interesting story because his main claim to fame is as an expert on foreign and defense policy. But he also has recently really been trying to burnish his credentials as a free market, low, tax-cutting, deregulating kind of leader. He wrote a column in the Daily Telegraph newspaper, which was very influential among conservatives in this country, on that kind of free market economic approach. You also have some candidates like the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Treasury Secretary Rishi Sunak, who resigned earlier this week, who I think would try to bolster himself as an economic liberalizer or tax cutter. I think the interesting thing about this race is that all of the people are positioning themselves more in line with Thatcherite traditional conservative positions on a lot of issues like economics and foreign policy. So I think that gives me some sense and perhaps even hope that this hasn't just been a fit of pique personally with Boris Johnson, but there also was a lot of frustration within the party on the leftward policy drift, and that there is a real desire, particularly among conservative members of parliament and reflecting their constituents back home, to take this opportunity of a leadership race to pull the party back to its Thatcherite roots. And so I am hoping that is going to become sort of the battle line that people will be fighting along as we get further into this leadership race.
Tories will have to move fast because they have to right this economy and show progress both on economic growth and prosperity and also getting inflation under control, because their main competitors, the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, is no longer as radical in its agenda as they were under Jeremy Corbyn and will be a more formidable competitor at the next election. But one final point I do want to make, and that is this point about the lessons for the U.S. Conservative Party, the Republicans. Kim talked about this. There is a faction on the American right. You see it in Marco Rubio in the U.S. Senate. You see it in Josh Hawley. You see it also in certain elements of the intellectual class on the right, Washington Post and Bloomberg, so-called conservatives. They believe that the key to winning the working class, much like Boris Johnson, is income redistribution, higher taxes on business and the affluent, to finance welfare payments to working class voters through child tax credits and child care subsidies and whatnot. Kim, how do you think the American right will react to Boris's troubles?
Those characters that you just mentioned will likely try to sweep under the carpet all the points that we have just been making, and they will try to suggest that this is all about the scandals and a failure of leadership in that regard. But as we've just been discussing, I think the lessons here are just so profound that the surest way to get yourself sideways with voters and even with your own party, or at least a big chunk of your own party, is to end up presiding over a very bad economy because of the policies that you instituted, ones that were very much in that redistributionist mold. The notion that you can put prosperity aside, you can put aside tax cutting, you can put aside free trade, you can put aside the idea of private entrepreneurialism, and instead embrace center-left policies that are fundamentally rooted in redistribution, and think that the economy will thrive and you will get all of those votes for the people to whom you are giving all the money. That's never been the political philosophy of, or at least not the modern conservative right, at least not since Goldwater and Reagan. And their philosophy is pretty tried and true, their approach. And so it should be a moment for those that you mentioned, Paul, to step back and realize the folly. I unfortunately am a little cynical and not quite sure we'll get there anytime soon.
I wouldn't call it cynical. I would call it realistic in your expectation. All right, Kim, thanks very much. Kim Strassel. Thank you, Joe Sternberg from London. Thank you all for listening. And remember, you can send us your catcalls and whatnot at pwpodcast@wsj.com. Look forward to hearing from you. And thanks very much for listening.